the sharp, wet scrape of a silver spatula against a porcelain bowl. The air inside the dressing chamber hangs heavy, suffocating under the astringent stench of sour vinegar and fermenting horse manure. A thick white paste is lifted from the dish. It touches the forehead of Eleanor. She is 22 years old. She has an infant son asleep down the hall and a laugh that commands the entire estate. She sits perfectly still before a polished mirror, illuminated by a single candle doing the work God forgot to do. She does not flinch as the compound is worked down her neck. The cold of the paste spreads across her collarbones, a creeping chill that never ever warms. Stroke by stroke, the raw mixture is driven deep into her pores. It is designed to dry into a flawless porcelain shell. But beneath that hardening mask, an invisible microscopic violence is already taking place. The pure lead carbonate is binding to her red blood cells. It is seeping into her nervous system. It is crossing the blood-brain barrier. Silence fills the room. It is a silence with a texture, thick, medicinal, and terribly final. Eleanor quietly asks for a second coat to hide a faint blemish on her cheek. By the end of the year, her vision will blur and her hands will violently shake. Her hair will fall out in clumps upon her silk pillow. Her skin will wither and peel away in rotting gray ribbons. She will die screaming in unimaginable agony, entirely consumed by the very thing painted onto her face. But the terrifying mystery of this era is not why Eleanor died. The question is why, knowing exactly how gruesome the end would be, the wealthiest and most educated women in the world continued to eagerly pay a fortune to slowly rot alive. The echo of that silver spatula scraping against the porcelain bowl was never the sound of a shallow vanity ritual. It was the mechanical, deliberate rhythm of a desperate and brutal economic transaction playing out behind heavily draped windows. We look back at the women of the 18th and 19th centuries and comfort ourselves by dismissing them as ignorant victims of a primitive world. We tell ourselves they simply did not understand the chemistry of the human body, or that they were tragically blinded by the shifting trends of high society fashion. But they were working with the absolute best information available to them, and that information was a cathedral of perfectly constructed logic built entirely on a foundation of sand. They were completely wrong in the way a compass is wrong when you are standing precisely at the North Pole, acting with total confidence while heading toward fatal consequences. In this deeply rigid society, a woman's physical complexion was not merely a matter of personal aesthetics or finding a romantic partner. A face completely untouched by the harsh sun was the ultimate undeniable proof that a woman did not have to labor in the dirt of the fields to survive. A flawless layer of white skin, perfectly devoid of smallpox scars, was the only currency that could save a young woman from absolute, grinding poverty. It signaled genetic purity and untouched wealth to the specific men who held the absolute, terrifying power to either elevate her family or leave them to starve in the streets. If you had been born into this suffocating reality, you would not have balked at the strange, metallic smell rising from those glass jars. When your physical safety, your shelter, and your entire future depend entirely on the visual geometry of your face, you do not ask the apothecary what is inside the compound. You would have believed the promises of the highly educated men who sold it to you, and you would have eagerly handed over your wages to secure your survival. The market simply demanded an impossible standard of porcelain perfection, and the earth generously provided the heavy elements required to manufacture that specific illusion. A thriving, deeply respected industry of legitimate physicians and chemists rose to build an empire bridging the gap between a woman's desperation and nature's most toxic offerings. They built their towering reputations by erasing human imperfections, making eyes appear unnervingly wide, and transforming ordinary breathing women into living, immovable marble statues. Opting out of this societal arms race meant willingly making yourself invisible in a brutal world where visibility was literally the only leverage a woman possessed. But to truly understand the scale of this quiet massacre, you have to look into the private laboratory of the man who legally patented the very powder that would rot their bones. Deep inside the damp, unventilated cellars of the finest apothecaries, the manufacturing of these flawless cosmetics was an act of industrialized, meticulous poisoning. Heavy, solid plates of pure lead were carefully suspended over shallow earthenware bowls filled with incredibly strong, biting acidic vinegar. These bowls were then deliberately buried deep inside massive steaming beds of actively fermenting horse manure left to bake in the dark. The intense natural heat generated by the rotting dung would slowly vaporize the acid, forcing it to eat away at the hanging heavy metal. Over the course of several weeks, the lead would bloom into a thick, beautiful, incredibly toxic white crust known to the world as Venetian Ceruse. The dedicated chemists who harvested this deadly frost did not see themselves as purveyors of death, nor did they view their creation as a weapon. From behind the counter of a prestigious pharmacy, this white powder was considered a genuine triumph of early modern science and artistic chemistry. Pure lead carbonate possesses an unparalleled, breathtaking opacity that reflects candlelight with a soft, ethereal glow no natural ingredient could ever hope to mimic. It grips the human skin aggressively, refusing to wash away in the sudden rain or melt under the nervous sweat of a crowded, breathless ballroom.
This is the pivot
From
point.
inside the airtight worldview of the men creating it, this was never an act of cruelty against the women who bought it. It was simple, elegant mathematics where applying the chemical compound equaled securing a marriage, which inherently equaled securing lifelong physical survival. Whatever hidden physical toll the heavy metal took on the body was simply viewed as the necessary tax a woman had to pay for existing in polite society. The architects of this compound were immensely proud of their work, firmly believing they had conquered nature to provide women with the ultimate shield against the world. But the uncompromising reality of heavy metal poisoning cannot be negotiated with, ignored, or rewritten by the sheer willpower of societal expectations. Because lead mimics the structure of calcium, the human body actively and eagerly absorbs the toxic metal directly into the bloodstream upon contact. A woman named Mary stood before her mirror, applying her daily layer of white paste, entirely unaware that her nervous system was pulling the toxins straight into her brain. The initial quiet warnings were always misdiagnosed by the very doctors who sold the powders, dismissed lightly as feminine melancholy or general hysteria. Mary experienced a dull, throbbing headache that never quite left her, followed by a slight, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers when she tried to hold a teacup. Then came the agonizing abdominal cramps, a pain so blinding and severe that women would frequently collapse onto the floor, desperately tearing at their own restrictive corsets. The tragedy deepened as the toxic buildup caused their natural skin to dry, wither, and turn a sickening, bruised shade of grayish blue. To hide the terrifying decay blooming across their own faces, the women believed they had only one logical option left available to them. They reached back into the glass jar and applied a significantly thicker, heavier layer of the poisonous lead directly over their dying tissue. It was a perfectly closed loop of suffering, an unbreakable cycle where the cure for the disfigurement was the exact substance causing the body to rot. The terrifying scale of this unseen epidemic becomes clear when you realize just how much of this heavy metal was passing through their veins. It was mathematically calculated that an average aristocratic woman applying her makeup daily would absorb up to 1/4 pound of raw, pure lead into her bloodstream every single year. This staggering, lethal exposure was not a tragic accident of unregulated back-alley commerce, but rather the highly protected, incredibly lucrative standard established by the highest medical authorities in the nation. To truly understand how a lethal epidemic becomes a normalized daily routine, we must step away from the velvet chairs of the vanity parlor and enter the hidden rooms where the actual compounding took place. Picture the private, heavily guarded workspace of an elite Victorian apothecary. The air inside these back rooms is entirely different from the light, perfumed atmosphere of the public storefronts. It is thick and suffocating, heavy with the stinging scent of burned sulfur, the greasy residue of melting wax, and the faintly sweet, sickening odor of decaying organic matter waiting to be distilled. Lined up meticulously along the dark oak shelves are rows of heavy, opaque glass vials, specifically designed to protect their volatile contents from the flickering, unstable candlelight. Let us unstopper the darkest vial on the shelf. Inside rests a thick, dark, syrupy liquid meticulously extracted from a plant known to botanists as Atropa belladonna. You likely know it by its much more honest, unforgiving name, deadly nightshade. Consuming a single small leaf of this wild plant carries enough venom to violently stop the beating heart of a healthy adult in a matter of minutes. Yet, women of the highest social standing would lie flat on their backs, tilt their heads toward the ceiling, and deliberately squeeze heavy drops of this potent neurotoxin directly into their own open, unblinking eyes. The underlying chemical logic driving this madness was as brilliant as it was devastating. The raw belladonna aggressively blocked the muscular receptors in the human eye, forcing the pupil to dilate to an unnatural, massive extreme. It instantly gave the wearer an expression of perpetual, feverish arousal and helpless innocence, physically transforming breathing women into living, wide-eyed dolls. It also slowly and permanently destroyed their optic nerves, forcing them to trade their long-term ability to see the physical world for the short-term privilege of being looked at. Beside the belladonna extract sat a much more unassuming, elegant container filled with small, chalky white discs. These were the infamous arsenic complexion wafers. The raw arsenic was mined from the deep earth, purified in massive industrial kilns that choked the surrounding towns with toxic smoke, and then shipped in bulk to these elegant city pharmacies. There, men in pristine white aprons would carefully measure the deadly white powder, binding it with simple sugar and baking soda to mask the sharp metallic taste of death. They were aggressively marketed as a gentle internal medical miracle meant to be nibbled on delicately after a heavy evening dinner. Arsenic functions by methodically attacking and completely destroying the oxygen-carrying red blood cells within the human body. The resulting lack of cellular oxygen created a stunning, ghostly pale complexion by literally suffocating the woman from the inside out. But the true, lingering horror of these substances is not found in their brutal chemical makeup. The profound horror lies in the sprawling, incredibly lucrative bureaucratic machinery that fiercely protected them. These deadly compounds were not being pushed by shadowy criminals hiding in cobblestone alleyways. They were proudly and heavily advertised in the most prestigious women's magazines of the era, nestled comfortably right next to polite articles about floral arrangements and high society etiquette. The manufacturers were wealthy, highly respected businessmen who paid massive sums of money to mainstream newspaper publishers to ensure their lethal products received glowing front-page endorsements. Highly credentialed doctors would gladly accept quiet, generous commissions to write authoritative medical pamphlets swearing by the absolute safety of swallowing low doses of arsenic. It was a perfectly designed, completely legal machine of human exploitation. The culture manufactured an impossible, punishing standard of physical beauty. The apothecaries manufactured the exact poison required to briefly achieve it. The medical establishment provided the unquestionable, comforting stamp of scientific approval, and the women simply paid the ultimate price, willingly funding the very economic system that was actively destroying their organs. When a young heiress quietly went blind or suffered massive unexplained organ failure, the official death certificate would gently list the cause as a weak feminine constitution or a sudden fever. If a grieving family ever attempted to sue a pharmacy for the sudden violent death of a daughter, the courts would invariably side with the wealthy manufacturer. The legal defense was always identical and always successful. They argued that the woman had simply misused a perfectly safe medical product, legally transferring the blame from the poisoner directly onto the corpse of the victim. The supply chain of suffering remained entirely uninterrupted, protected by men who wore fine-tailored suits and slept exceptionally well at night. It is incredibly easy to sit here today, safely separated by generations of medical advancement, and judge these historical victims for their sheer vanity and folly. It feels deeply comforting to believe that our modern society is far too educated, and our regulatory agencies are far too strict to ever allow such a barbaric cosmetic industry to thrive openly. But I want you to consider the most popular, completely normalized cosmetic procedure of our current decade. Every single day, millions of ordinary people walk into brightly lit, sterile clinics and pay licensed medical professionals a premium fee to inject botulinum toxin directly into their facial muscles. This specific substance is the single deadliest neurotoxin currently known to human science. A microscopic quantity of this exact toxin, weighing significantly less than a single grain of sand, is enough to paralyze and kill a fully grown human being. Yet we enthusiastically allow doctors to inject microdoses of it into our foreheads to temporarily paralyze our own flesh, simply to prevent the natural formation of human wrinkles. We took the deadliest poison on the entire earth, gave it a catchy commercial name, and turned it into a billion-dollar cosmetic routine that happens on a lunch break. The glass vials look significantly cleaner today, and the sterile needles are undoubtedly sharper, but the underlying psychology of the transaction has not changed a single degree. And exactly like the dark era of arsenic wafers and belladonna drops, the modern cosmetic empire owes its entire operational blueprint to the men who first realized that physical pain could be mass-produced, packaged, and legally patented. No one understood this terrible, lucrative alchemy better than a highly respected physician named Dr. James P. Campbell. Dr. James P. Campbell was not a monster lurking in the shadows of the 19th century medical establishment. He was a highly decorated, universally respected physician who operated out of a pristine, brightly lit office in New York. In the late 1880s, Campbell recognized an overwhelming, desperate demand for flawless, ghostly pale skin among the upper and middle classes. He chose to answer that societal desperation not with a topical cosmetic cream, but with a patented, mass-produced internal medical treatment. He formulated, packaged, and heavily distributed a product he officially named Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. The most terrifying realization about medical history is that its greatest atrocities are almost never committed by sadists or madmen seeking to inflict pain. They are committed by well-dressed, highly educated visionaries who are absolutely certain they are right. Campbell knew exactly what raw arsenic was, and he knew it had been the murder weapon of choice for 1,000 years of human history. As a classically trained physician, he intimately understood the brutal, inescapable symptoms of acute heavy metal toxicity. He knew that swallowing the element caused the violent vomiting of dark blood, agonizing muscular convulsions, and the slow, cascading failure of every major internal organ. But Campbell firmly believed in the absolute arrogance of his own specialized, patented dosage. He argued, publicly and with immense unchallenged medical authority, that his specific microdosing technique effectively neutralized the lethal nature of the poison. He confidently claimed his precise scientific preparation transformed a known killer into a gentle substance that actively purified the blood and regulated the nervous system. The first layer of betrayal here is that Campbell actively leveraged his hard-earned medical degree to convince inherently skeptical women to willingly consume rat poison. When a woman held that small cardboard box and felt a natural spike of terror at the word arsenic printed on the label, the medical credential put her mind completely at ease. He bypassed their natural evolutionary survival instincts by wrapping a lethal toxin in the ultimate unquestionable authority of his era. He used the esteemed title of doctor as an impenetrable shield against any and all rational questions from his patients. But the second layer of betrayal is far deeper, and it reveals a terrifying systemic truth about how medical authority fundamentally operates across all eras. The historical record clearly demonstrates that medical consensus inevitably bends to the overwhelming gravity of societal and economic demand. When an entire culture decides it wants a specific physical result badly enough, a licensed professional will always emerge to legitimize the inherent risk. They will wrap the human suffering in complex scientific jargon, place the procedure in a sterile environment, and attach an exorbitant price tag to the transaction. Campbell was simply the pioneer of an architectural blueprint that entire modern pharmaceutical and cosmetic empires utilize at this very exact moment. He realized that if you tell people a treatment is exclusively scientific, they will endure horrifying physical side effects without ever blaming the creator. As his pale, chalky wafers flooded the international market by the hundreds of thousands, the inevitable consequences began to quietly manifest. Reports began to circulate in private letters of young women losing feeling in their fingers and toes shortly after beginning the prescribed regimen. Families whispered behind closed doors about previously healthy daughters who developed sudden, unquenchable thirsts right before collapsing on their parlor floors. Medical journals of the era recorded isolated, scattered cases of patients suffering complete renal failure after consuming the complexion wafers for several continuous months. The heavy metal was accumulating in their tissues, exactly as basic chemistry dictates, slowly suffocating their cells from the inside out. Yet, Dr. Campbell never recalled a single shipment, nor did he issue a single warning or addendum to the public. Instead, he doubled his massive advertising budget and printed millions of new promotional pamphlets to distribute directly into the hands of anxious young girls. When confronted with the declining health of his customers, he simply argued that they had failed to follow his exact scientific instructions, completely shifting the blame to the dying women. He constructed an official medical justification that would become the foundational operating procedure for every corporate cosmetic tragedy that followed over the next century. He believed that the flaw was never in the drug, but always in the imperfect human body consuming it. Listen closely to the doctor's own promotional words, officially published and legally distributed to the trusting public in 1890. Do not be alarmed by the word arsenic, for it is the greatest beautifier of the complexion, removing all blemishes, freckles, and sallowness. It is perfectly harmless when prepared by my exclusive scientific method. He wrote those exact, fiercely confident words while his own patients were slowly losing feeling in their extremities. He signed his prestigious name to those specific advertisements while women's internal organs were quietly, systematically shutting down under the heavy weight of his scientific method. And here's the fact that should keep you awake at night. He did not write those words because he was a sociopath trying to orchestrate a mass poisoning for his own twisted financial amusement. He wrote them because he genuinely, fundamentally believed that his medical genius had tamed the laws of nature. He was utterly convinced that the agonizing, sometimes fatal side effects were simply an acceptable, necessary cost of doing business in the pursuit of perfection. Dr. Campbell was never brought to trial, he never lost his medical license, and he died a wealthy, deeply respected man surrounded by peers who admired his innovation. He was not a monster plotting in the dark, but a believer in his own total infallibility. And history proves, time and time again, that believers are the most dangerous people in any room. To truly grasp the gravity of this medical era, we have to look away from the ledgers of the wealthy men who manufactured these compounds. We have to look directly at the people who actually swallowed them. Her name was Amelia. She was 19 years old and worked 14 long hours a day as a seamstress in the damp garment district of London in 1887. She had 3 younger sisters who relied entirely on her weekly wages just to afford coal for the winter. She had a quiet, desperate hope of marrying a young clerk she'd been speaking to softly after church on Sundays. Her only crime was wanting to clear a sudden angry rash of blemishes on her chin before a rare community dance. Amelia saved 2 full weeks of her meager wages to buy a single cardboard box of arsenic complexion wafers. She did not read the chemical warnings printed on the back of the package because she could not read. She only knew that the man smiling warmly on the advertising poster was a respected doctor, and doctors did not sell poison to working girls. The first week of taking the wafers brought what felt like an absolute miracle. Her skin cleared beautifully, taking on a smooth, flawless pallor that made her look exactly like the wealthy aristocratic women she sewed heavy dresses for. But by the middle of the 3rd week, the persistent, unquenchable thirst began to take hold of her. She woke up in the dead of night with a terrible burning sensation in her throat that made swallowing a simple cup of water feel like swallowing broken glass. Then there was Charlotte, living in a quiet neighborhood in Boston just 2 decades earlier. She was 31 years old and the fiercely dedicated mother of 2 young boys. She had survived a mild childhood case of smallpox, but the faint pitted scars left on her left cheek made her feel deeply invisible to her own husband. Charlotte applied a heavy lead cosmetic paste every single morning to fill the scars, desperate to hold her fragile family together. When her hands began to shake violently at the breakfast table, she simply hid them beneath her heavy linen apron so her children would not worry. When her vision began to darken and blur at the edges, she blamed the dim, poor lighting of the kitchen windows. Finally, there was Clara, a 26-year-old schoolteacher who merely wanted her tired eyes to look a little brighter for a formal portrait photograph. She purchased a small glass vial of belladonna drops from a highly recommended apothecary in the center of her bustling industrial town. She tipped her head back in her lonely boarding house room and squeezed the dark liquid directly into her eyes. The burning sensation was immediate and profound, but the well-dressed man at the pharmacy counter had promised her that the pain was simply the feeling of the medicine working. By the time she finally sat down for the photograph, her pupils were so massively dilated she could barely see the face of the man operating the heavy camera. Within 3 short months, Clara was quietly let go from her teaching position because she could no longer read the chalk words she wrote on her own blackboard. None of these women ever suspected that the medicine they were taking to secure their future was the exact thing tearing their bodies apart. They trusted the elegant labels, they trusted the high price tags, and they trusted the educated men wearing crisp white coats. The sheer confusion they felt at the very end was entirely absolute and deeply solitary. Amelia lay awake in her cramped, freezing bedroom, unable to feel her own toes, profoundly ashamed because she believed she had simply caught a bad fever from working too hard. She died silently on a Tuesday morning, using her final breaths to apologize to her younger sisters for being too weak to go to the factory. Charlotte passed away a few years earlier, coughing up dark blood onto the wooden floorboards of her own home, while her sons cried in the hallway. Clara vanished into the brutal poverty of the 19th century blind asylums, entirely forgotten by the students she used to teach. There were no massive public outcries for any of them. There were no furious front-page newspaper exposés demanding justice for a poor seamstress, a tired mother, or a blind teacher. Their local neighborhood physicians arrived after the fact, shook their heads solemnly, and confidently wrote down natural causes on the official death certificates. Amelia was buried in an unmarked communal dirt grave at the cold edge of the expanding city. Charlotte was laid to rest with a quiet family service, and her husband remarried another woman within the calendar year. The elegant pharmacies that legally sold them their deaths simply opened their heavy wooden doors the very next morning to serve a new line of customers. The cosmetic companies recorded their purchases as standard daily revenue, added the silver coins to the vault, and completely erased their humanity from the historical record. These women became nothing more than silent, invisible statistics in a massive, towering ledger of corporate medical profit. Nobody ever bothered to record what their final agonizing moments truly felt like in the dark. The crushing, heavy silence surrounding their suffering is not just a missing piece of the historical story. That carefully engineered, highly purposeful silence is the entire story. We like to sit in our modern homes and think we are fundamentally different from Amelia, Charlotte, and Clara. We like to believe that our modern intuition would somehow warn us that we would read the chemical ingredients and possess the wisdom to walk away. But in 1887, if you had walked into that brightly lit pharmacy with a dull complexion and a desperate, deeply human need to be seen as beautiful, you would not have hesitated for a single second. If you felt the crushing, suffocating weight of society constantly telling you that your worth to the world was tied entirely to your face, you would have gladly handed over your own money. You would have taken the wafer, you would have applied the paste, and you would have swallowed the poison. This is exactly what would have happened to you. Not to someone who looks like you. To you. We must return to the heavy, suffocating silence of that dressing chamber where Eleanor sits perfectly still before her polished silver mirror. We must finally answer the terrifying question of why a 22-year-old mother would willingly let a cosmetician paint pure, raw lead across her collarbones. She did not eagerly pay a fortune to slowly rot alive out of some shallow, blinding sense of feminine vanity. She chose the crushing weight of the white paste because, in the brutal and unyielding arithmetic of her era, the agonizing decay of her own body was the exact price of her infant son's survival. She deliberately traded her long-term vision, the integrity of her nervous system, and her very flesh to maintain the flawless social facade that kept her fragile family from starving in the unforgiving streets. The true, lingering nightmare of this era is that consuming the poison was never a tragic mistake born of mere ignorance. It was the absolute only rational, calculated choice available to a human being trapped inside a towering, inescapable system that valued her pristine porcelain surface significantly more than her actively beating heart. But the immense tragedy of Eleanor, alongside the thousands of faceless, silent women who died exactly like her, did not simply evaporate into the dark vacuum of forgotten history. The sheer, undeniable scale of their collective physical suffering eventually forced the fiercely stubborn medical establishment to begin carefully mapping how foreign elements accumulate within human tissue over time. The rigorous, life-saving modern science of toxicology was built entirely upon the delayed, horrifying autopsies of women who were systematically poisoned for corporate profit. The very federal regulatory protocols that currently keep dangerous lead paint out of your child's bedroom and lethal arsenic out of your municipal water supply were written directly in their blood. We owe our entire fundamental medical understanding of how silent neurotoxins aggressively cross the human blood-brain barrier directly to the broken, decaying bodies of desperate seamstresses and tired young mothers. This era was a massive, unforgivable systemic atrocity orchestrated by highly educated men wearing pristine white coats. And that exact same historical atrocity gave the modern world the foundational diagnostic standards that actively save millions of innocent lives today. Both of these crushing heavy realities are entirely true at the exact same time, and neither one is permitted to cancel out the profound weight of the other. The widely respected doctors, the wealthy apothecaries, and the brilliant chemists in this story were never operating outside the accepted moral consensus of their time. They were the absolute, unquestionable consensus, which means the only genuine, terrifying question worth sitting with in the dark is this: what is the widely celebrated, completely normalized medical or cosmetic procedure of our current decade that a documentary made in the year 2124 will describe exactly the way I just described theirs?